Millionaire woman, after becoming sterile, decides to go to an orphanage in search of an heir. But upon arriving at the orphanage, she finds a boy identical to her deceased fiancé. The morning sun gently invaded Megan's apartment, warming the rooms with a golden and cozy light. She woke up early that day, feeling an unusual lightness, as if her heart was more at peace and hopeful than ever. When she got up, she noticed that something inside her felt different, an indescribable sensation that made her smile to herself while still standing barefoot by the bed. She headed to the kitchen, where she prepared her breakfast, her mind elsewhere. Megan was distracted, but not with worries. On the contrary, there was a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Life with Paul was good, full of affection and complicity, but lately she felt that something was missing. Perhaps a change, a new beginning. After having breakfast and getting ready for the day, Megan decided to take a pregnancy test. It was something she had been putting off for a few days, but now intuition urged her to act. When she saw the 2 pink lines appear on the test, her heart nearly stopped. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment she just stood there in the bathroom in silence, absorbing the enormity of the discovery. She was pregnant. Megan sat on the living room sofa, still stunned by the revelation, but her mind was already beginning to formulate plans. She needed to tell Paul in a special way, something that would reflect the joy she felt at that moment. He had always been an attentive and loving man, and she knew he would be delighted with the news. She decided she wouldn't wait. Paul deserved to know as soon as possible. When Paul arrived home that night, Megan greeted him with a mysterious smile. He immediately noticed the difference in her mood. "What happened?" he asked with a curious look as he took off his shoes in the entrance hall. "I have a surprise for you," she said, pulling him by the hand into the living room. There on the coffee table was a small package with a delicate bow. Paul looked at her with a playful and curious smile before picking up the package and starting to open it. Inside, he found a pair of white baby shoes. For a second, Paul was silent, processing what that meant. Then his eyes widened and he looked at Megan, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "We're having a baby, Paul," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Paul couldn't contain the laughter and tears that came simultaneously. He hugged her tightly, spinning her around in an explosion of happiness. The idea of becoming parents, of building a family together, seemed like the perfect next chapter in their story. After calming down, they spent the rest of the night planning the future. They talked about names, how they would tell their friends and family, and even how they would decorate the baby's room. The love and joy they felt were palpable, as if a new energy had taken over their lives. The next day, Paul suggested they take a trip to celebrate the big news. Megan loved the idea. They were financially comfortable, and a trip to the coast would be the perfect setting to celebrate this new beginning. The trip would be short, just a weekend, but enough to recharge and start dreaming about the future. On Saturday afternoon, they hit the road towards the beach. The journey was peaceful, with the sound of the waves mixing with laughter and conversations in the car. The sky was clear, the weather mild, and everything seemed in harmony. However, on the way back home after a dinner by the sea and a final walk on the sand, night fell heavily, and fatigue began to affect Paul. Megan noticed that he was blinking more slowly and suggested they stop somewhere to rest. Paul, however, insisted that they were close to home and could rest once they arrived. Then in the silence of the night, while Megan dozed in the passenger seat, the inevitable happened. Paul, exhausted, lost control of the car for a brief second, but enough for it to veer off the road and crash violently into an embankment. The impact was devastating. Megan was thrown against the dashboard, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the image of Paul, motionless at the wheel, his eyes closed. Darkness took over, and silence reigned, interrupted only by the distant sound of the sea and the approaching sirens. Megan slowly opened her eyes, feeling the intense white light of the surrounding environment. Everything seemed out of focus. The white walls and indistinct shapes around her danced before her confused eyes. The sensation of weight in her body and the pain radiating from every limb made her groan in weakness. She tried to move, but her body was heavy, pinned to the bed. Then she noticed the rhythmic sound of a heart monitor beside her, matching the rapid beat of her heart. She was in a hospital. A nurse approached, noticing that Megan had woken up. Her steps were hurried but gentle, and her expression was one of concern. Megan tried to speak, but her voice came out weak, an incomprehensible murmur. "Calm down, Mrs. Megan, you're safe now," said the nurse, adjusting the pillows around her. "You were in an accident, but we're taking care of you." The word accident reverberated in Megan's mind like a distant, meaningless echo. She tried to remember what had happened, but everything was blurred, like a bad dream that dissolves upon waking. Her mind searched for answers, but all it found was emptiness. "Paul," she finally murmured, managing to pronounce his name. "Where is Paul?" The nurse hesitated, her gaze revealing more than her words could hide. "We'll call the doctor to talk to you. He can explain everything." Megan felt a pang of fear grow inside her. Something was wrong. She knew it. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her abdomen forced her to give up. When she looked down, she saw she was bandaged around her belly, and a feeling of panic overtook her. Something was terribly wrong. Shortly after the doctor entered the room, his expression one Megan would never forget. The mixture of compassion and sadness in his eyes could only mean one thing. "Mrs. Megan, my name is Dr. William. You were in a serious accident and I'm deeply sorry, but I need to tell you what happened." Megan's world began to spin. Every word that came out of the doctor's mouth felt like a sentence. He explained that the car had veered off the road and crashed head-on into an embankment. Paul had died on impact, and the paramedics who arrived at the scene could do nothing to save him. Megan, on the other hand, had been found unconscious with multiple fractures and internal injuries. "Your condition was critical, but you're a strong woman. You fought to survive." The doctor paused before continuing, as if searching for the right words. "However, due to the severity of your injuries, we couldn't save the baby." Megan's world shattered. Her body trembled as she tried to process what she had just heard. Paul was dead. Her baby, that tiny being she had just begun to love, was also gone. She felt herself drowning in an abyss of pain so deep that everything around her became insignificant, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Megan couldn't breathe. She couldn't cry. Her body was in shock, her mind refusing to accept reality. She tried to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she let out a low, primal scream that echoed through the room like the sound of a heart breaking. The doctor kept talking, but she could barely hear him. His words were a distant hum, muffled by the pain that now consumed her entire being. He mentioned that her uterus had been severely damaged in the accident and that to save her life, they had to remove it. The doctor's final sentence sealed Megan's fate. "Unfortunately, you won't be able to have children anymore." Megan felt like her world ended right there. The weight of the news crushed whatever strength she had left. She had lost Paul, lost the baby, and now the dream of being a mother had been ripped away from her forever. Night fell over the hospital, and with it, Megan found herself alone in her pain. The hours dragged on, each second a cruel reminder of the new reality she would have to face. The hospital room felt increasingly tight, as if the walls were closing in on her, slowly suffocating her. She tried to find a reason, any reason, to keep going. But all she could feel was an immense emptiness, a pain so deep it seemed impossible to bear. Megan wondered if she would ever rise from this fall, if life would ever have any meaning again. But for now, all she could think about was this. Everything she loved, everything she had lived for until that moment, had been taken from her in the blink of an eye. The days following Megan's discharge from the hospital were shrouded in a dense fog of pain and confusion. The apartment she and Paul had shared, once so full of life, now felt like a silent tomb where memories danced like shadows in every corner. The bed that once held the two of them now seemed immense and empty, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Megan spent her days wandering around the apartment, disoriented, unable to find a purpose. Paul's personal belongings, his clothes, his photographs, everything around her seemed to mock her pain, constantly reminding her that he was gone forever. At night, she could barely sleep, and when she did, she was tormented by nightmares. In her dreams, Paul appeared shrouded in shadows, his face always partially hidden. He seemed to want to say something, but the words never reached her, leaving her more confused and anguished. These dreams initially terrified her, but as the days passed, Megan began to realize that something was different about them. Paul seemed to be trying to guide her, but where? What was he trying to show her? These questions began to consume her thoughts, further distancing her from reality. The sleepless nights, the absence of answers, and the constant pain began to erode Megan's sanity. She found herself talking to herself, looking for signs of Paul everywhere. The loneliness was crushing. At one point, she felt she was on the brink of completely losing her mind. The grief was not just for the loss of Paul and the baby, but also for the woman she once was. It was during one of those sleepless nights, when the silence of the apartment became unbearable, that Megan decided she needed to leave. She needed air, needed something to reconnect her with the real world, to pull her out of that endless cycle of pain and despair. The next morning, Megan left the apartment with no particular destination, just an urgent need to escape the memories that were suffocating her. The streets were bustling. Life went on as usual, unaware of the suffering she carried. As she walked, she felt even more isolated, as if separated from the rest of the world by an invisible barrier. Then, in the midst of her aimless walk, her eyes were drawn to a small, discreet sign, Santa Clara Orphanage. The words stood out as if illuminated by their own light, calling to her in a way she couldn't ignore. Megan stopped in front of the entrance, hesitant. The idea of entering an orphanage, of being surrounded by children, seemed too much for her, especially after everything she had lost. But something inside her pushed her forward, a force she couldn't explain. When she finally crossed the orphanage gates, she was greeted by a sense of calm, almost as if the place had been waiting for her. The sound of children laughing echoed in the distance, bringing a lightness that contrasted sharply with the darkness she carried. Megan felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of sadness and hope, but also something else, something indefinable. Inside the orphanage, she was received by Karen, the director, a middle-aged woman who exuded a serenity that immediately calmed Megan. Karen, with her welcoming smile, gave Megan a brief tour of the place, showing her the dormitories, classrooms, and the courtyard where the children played. Megan tried to focus on Karen's words, but her mind was distant, still trapped in the disturbing images of her dreams with Paul. As she walked through the orphanage's corridors, Megan felt an inexplicable connection with the place. It was as if something there was calling to her, something she still couldn't understand. Every child she saw, every smile that crossed her path, touched a sensitive chord inside her, awakening feelings she thought she had lost forever. However, Megan wasn't ready to understand what all of that meant. At the end of the visit, she thanked Karen and promised to return. Something about that place was pulling her back, something she knew she needed to explore, but she wasn't ready yet. As she left the orphanage, Megan felt a slight relief, as if a small thread of hope had been planted in her heart. She returned home that day a little different. Although the pain was still present, there was now a seed of curiosity, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, something new could emerge from the ashes of her destroyed life. The dreams with Paul continued, but now she felt that they were guiding her to something greater, something that was still to come. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the orphanage courtyard, a joyful melody that contrasted with the weight on Megan's heart. She had returned to Santa Clara Orphanage a few days after her first visit, unable to ignore the silent call that place exerted over her. Karen, the director, welcomed her again with her warm smile, noticing that something in Megan had changed since the last visit, as if she was searching for something, or perhaps someone. As Karen guided Megan through the corridors once again, talking about the children's routines and activities, Megan could barely concentrate on the words. Her mind was scattered, lost in thoughts about Paul, her recurring dreams, and the persistent feeling that something bigger was happening. She wasn't sure what she expected to find there, but she felt she was on the right path. As they approached the courtyard where some children were playing happily, something made Megan stop suddenly. Her gaze was drawn to a corner where a boy of about 8 years old was sitting, watching the other children with a serious, almost introspective expression. He was alone, enveloped in a silence that seemed to contradict the energy around him. There was something familiar about that boy, something that made Megan's heart race in a disconcerting way. She approached slowly, as if guided by an invisible force, while Karen continued talking, unaware of the sudden change in Megan's behavior. When the boy finally looked up and his eyes met Megan's, the world seemed to stop. The impact was immediate. Lucas, as Karen casually called him, was the spitting image of Paul. His features, the shape of his face, even the intensity in his gaze. Everything about him reminded Megan of Paul in an almost supernatural way. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. How was this possible? Was it just her mind, still submerged in grief, playing tricks on her? Or was there something deeper and more mysterious behind this resemblance? Lucas, noticing Megan's fixed gaze, lowered his eyes shyly, as if unsure how to react to the sudden attention. Megan tried to speak, but the words seemed to have been ripped from her throat. She was paralyzed between disbelief and fear, struggling against the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Karen noticed the interaction and smiled gently. "This is Lucas. He's a very dear boy." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Lucas lost his mother at birth and never knew his father. It's been hard for him, but he's a strong boy." Megan couldn't take her eyes off Lucas. Karen's words seemed to echo in her mind, mingling with her own chaotic thoughts. The resemblance between Lucas and Paul was so striking that it was beginning to seem impossible that it was just a coincidence. And if there was something more, something she needed to discover. Part of Megan, still immersed in pain and grief, feared she was projecting her emotions onto this innocent child. What if she was just seeing what she wanted to see, but the connection she felt with Lucas was undeniable, a bond she couldn't explain but also couldn't ignore. It was as if her entire being was screaming at her to pay attention, not to let slip what was right before her eyes. Throughout the rest of the visit, Megan kept Lucas in sight, discreetly observing him as he interacted with the other children. With each look, each movement, the feeling that he could be related to Paul grew within her, forming a knot of uncertainty and curiosity that she knew she needed to unravel. When it was time to leave, Megan felt an internal resistance, as if part of her wanted to stay. Before leaving, she approached Karen and, with a trembling voice, asked more about Lucas. Karen, always kind, told her everything she knew, that Lucas had been brought to the orphanage as a baby after his mother's death, and that no information about his father had been found. Megan left the orphanage with a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil. Lucas's resemblance to Paul, the absence of information about the boy's father, the disturbing dreams with Paul. Everything seemed to intertwine in a mystery that she felt an urgent need to solve. That night, alone in her apartment, Megan reflected on everything she had seen and felt that day. The idea that Lucas could somehow be related to Paul seemed crazy, but the connection she felt was too real to ignore. She knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she discovered the truth. That's when Megan made a decision. She would hire a private investigator to uncover Lucas's history. She needed to know where he came from, who his parents were, and if there was any connection to Paul. The uncertainty and curiosity were beginning to consume Megan, and the only way to find peace would be to discover the truth, no matter how painful or unbelievable it might be. Megan wasted no time. The curiosity and restlessness that had consumed her since the encounter with Lucas drove her to act quickly. The next morning, after a restless and sleepless night, she picked up the phone and made a call that would change the course of her life. She hired Manuel, a private investigator known for his discretion and effectiveness, and scheduled a meeting with him to discuss what she had discovered so far. Manuel's office was located in an old building in the city center, a place that exuded an air of mystery and hidden secrets. When Megan entered, she was greeted by Manuel himself, a middle-aged man with a robust appearance and keen eyes that seemed capable of uncovering any secret. After a brief exchange of greetings, Megan got straight to the point, recounting Lucas's story and the disturbing resemblance he had to Paul. "I know it may seem crazy, Manuel, but something tells me there's more to this story than meets the eye," said Megan, trying to organize her thoughts. "I need to know the truth. I need to know who this boy is, and why he looks so much like Paul." Manuel listened attentively, his expressions revealing little of what he thought. After a few minutes, he nodded slowly. "I'll start by investigating the available records about Lucas," he said, taking a notepad. "If he was brought to the orphanage, there must be some documentation, even if minimal. I'll see what I can find." Megan thanked him and left Manuel's office with a heavy heart, but a spark of hope. If there was something to be discovered, Manuel would find it. Meanwhile, she would have to deal with the increasingly intense dreams that continued to haunt her every night. The following days were marked by agonizing waiting. Megan found herself increasingly immersed in memories of Paul, as if her mind was trying to show her something she still couldn't understand. The dreams became more vivid and detailed. Paul appeared in familiar places, but always shrouded in a fog that made it difficult to see his face clearly. He seemed agitated, as if he wanted to tell her something important, but the words never reached her. One night, the dream was different. Paul was in their room, the same one where they had shared so many conversations and laughs. He seemed closer, more real. Megan approached him, but before she could touch him, he whispered something that made her wake up abruptly. "Find the truth." Megan woke up startled, her heart racing. The phrase echoed in her mind, so clear and urgent that she knew she couldn't ignore it. Paul was trying to tell her something, and she was determined to find out what it was. A few days later, Manuel got in touch. He had made progress in the investigation and wanted to meet with her to discuss what he had discovered. Megan went to the meeting with a mix of anxiety and hope, trying to prepare herself for what she might hear. In Manuel's office, he presented the initial results of the investigation. The records at the orphanage confirmed the basic story that Karen had told. Lucas had been brought to the orphanage as a baby after his mother's death during childbirth. There was no information about the father, and the few available documents seemed to indicate that Lucas was just another of the many children without a family at the institution. So far, there's nothing to suggest a direct link between Lucas and Paul, said Manuel in a professional and restrained tone. But there are some gaps in the records. The orphanage received Lucas from a local hospital, but there aren't many details about his mother or any close relatives. I'll keep investigating these loose ends. Megan listened carefully, but her mind was focused on something else. The resemblance. She couldn't help but think there was more beyond the records, something that hadn't yet been revealed. "Manuel, do you think it's possible that this resemblance is just a coincidence?" asked Megan, her voice filled with uncertainty. Manuel looked at her with an evaluating gaze. "Coincidences exist, but they're rare. What you've described is at the very least intriguing. I'll dig deeper. There might be something that hasn't come to light yet. In the meantime, I suggest you continue observing Lucas's behavior. Sometimes the answers are where we least expect them." Megan nodded, knowing that the wait would be agonizing. What else could be hidden in Lucas's story? And why did she feel so strongly that Paul was trying to communicate with her, even after his death? The questions continued to grow, and Megan knew she wouldn't rest until they were all answered. The days that followed were long and full of tension. Megan tried to distract herself with everyday tasks, but her mind kept returning incessantly to Lucas and the mystery surrounding him. The nights were even harder, with the dreams of Paul becoming almost real, as if he were beside her, whispering secrets she still couldn't fully understand. The days leading up to the revelation were marked by almost unbearable tension. Megan lived in a state of constant anxiety, her mind torn between hope and fear of what was to come. Manuel had suggested doing a DNA test, an idea that initially seemed absurd, but soon became the only way to quell the doubts consuming Megan. The collection process was meticulous. Manuel had obtained, through his contacts, permission to exhume Paul's remains, a decision Megan did not take lightly. The thought of disturbing Paul's rest tormented her, but the need to know the truth drove her. The collection of Lucas's samples was done discreetly during an outing Megan organized. They went for ice cream together, and at that moment, seeing Lucas smiling innocently, Megan almost gave up. The idea that he could be Paul's son, and that all of this would bring to light secrets from the past, terrified her. The days following the DNA collection were a silent torture. Megan spent sleepless nights haunted by increasingly intense dreams with Paul, where he appeared closer, more real, but still mysterious, as if he were on the verge of revealing something crucial, but always interrupted by Megan's own consciousness, which would wake her up. Finally, Manuel scheduled a meeting to reveal the results. Megan arrived at his office with her heart pounding, a mix of fear and hope intertwining in her mind. Sitting across from Manuel, she noticed the gravity in his gaze, something that made her hold her breath. "Megan, the DNA test results are in," Manuel began in a calm and controlled voice that didn't hide the importance of what he was about to say. "Lucas is indeed Paul's son." The words seemed to echo in Megan's mind as if the world around her had frozen. She remained silent, unable to process the information. It was as if everything she had lived through up until that moment was a preparation for this revelation. Paul, the man she had loved so deeply, had a son, and that son was now before her, alive, breathing, a part of him still present in the world. The confusion of emotions that hit her was overwhelming. Joy and pain, love and betrayal, hope and despair, all these feelings clashed within Megan, leaving her breathless. On one hand, she felt grateful to have found a part of Paul still alive, something she never expected to find. But on the other hand, the shock of discovering that Paul had an unknown son left her devastated. How had this happened? Why had he never mentioned Lucas? What did this mean for the relationship they had? As Megan's mind raced through these questions, a crucial detail finally emerged, bringing a new layer of shock. Lucas was 8 years old, but she and Paul had been together for only 3. This meant that Paul had had this child long before they met. The impact of this realization was devastating. Paul, the man she loved and trusted, had lived a life before her, a life he had never spoken of, a life that was now right in front of her, in the form of an 8-year-old boy. "How is this possible?" Megan finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. "Paul never mentioned having a child. He was with me the whole time. How could he hide something like this?" Manuel took a deep breath before answering. "I don't have all the answers, Megan. But the fact is that somehow Paul had this child before you met, and Lucas is here now. What we know is that Lucas's mother died in childbirth, and the boy was brought to the orphanage shortly after. It's possible that Paul never knew of Lucas's existence, or there may be more to this story than we can see at first glance." Megan shook her head, still trying to absorb everything. The idea that Paul could have had a child without her knowledge was almost unbearable, but she also knew that there were so many things that could have happened without her knowing. Paul's past had always been a bit nebulous, with parts of his life that he rarely discussed. The weight of responsibility began to fall on Megan. What would she do now? Lucas was an innocent boy, blameless for the past, and now she knew he was the son of the man she loved. What did this mean for their future? Megan knew she couldn't ignore the connection she felt with Lucas, but she was also aware of the moral and emotional implications of this discovery. How could she explain this to him? How could she herself understand and accept this new reality? Megan spent the following days in a state of deep introspection. The pain of imagined betrayal, the joy of finding a part of Paul still alive, and the uncertainty about how to proceed left her emotionally exhausted. She knew she needed to make a decision, but every option seemed loaded with consequences she wasn't ready to face. As she reflected on all of this, Megan also wondered if she should tell Lucas the truth. He had the right to know. But how do you explain to an 8-year-old child that the man he never knew was his father? And moreover, how would this affect their relationship? Amid all this emotional chaos, Megan decided she needed more time to process everything. She needed to understand herself, her emotions, before making any definitive decisions about Lucas's future. But one thing was certain: she could no longer ignore the bond she felt with him. Lucas was a part of Paul, a part that she felt responsible for protecting and loving. The days following the discovery of the relationship between Lucas and Paul were marked by intense emotional turmoil for Megan. She began to visit Lucas more frequently at the orphanage, trying to build a relationship with him. However, each interaction was marked by a mix of affection and doubt. Lucas, with his innocent nature, began to grow attached to Megan, seeing her as a figure of comfort and security. He greeted her with a smile each time he saw her, unaware of the complexity unfolding in Megan's thoughts. She, on the other hand, felt increasingly torn. There were moments when she looked at Lucas and saw only a child who needed love and care. But at other times, she saw in him the reflection of Paul's secret, a past she had never known existed. With each visit, the dilemma about whether or not to tell Lucas the truth grew inside her. How could she explain to him that the man he never knew was his father? And moreover, how could she herself deal with this truth when she could barely accept that Paul had lived a life before meeting her? A life that now materialized before her in the form of an 8-year-old boy? Megan's nights continued to be haunted by dreams of Paul. In one of them, Paul appeared next to Lucas, smiling at her as if he were at peace, but without saying a word. She woke up with the feeling that time was running out, that she would soon need to make a decision. Finally, Megan realized she couldn't continue living in this uncertainty. Lucas deserved to know the truth, and she knew she couldn't keep hiding it from him, no matter how painful it might be. She decided that the next conversation with him would be crucial. But first, she needed to find the right words, something that tormented her because she didn't know how he would react. The relationship between them was growing, but for Megan, the challenge of telling Lucas the truth loomed like a constant shadow. She knew that the revelation would change everything, and the fear of losing the bond they were beginning to build was overwhelming. But deep down, she knew that the truth had to be told. Only then could she begin to rebuild her life and help Lucas understand his. The morning was clear and calm, but Megan's heart was racing as she prepared for the conversation that would change everything. She knew that day would mark a before and after in Lucas's life, and hers too. The weight of responsibility for what she was about to reveal was almost unbearable, but Megan knew she couldn't delay any longer. Lucas deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Megan went to pick up Lucas at the orphanage and took him to a nearby park, a quiet place full of old trees that offered shade and a bit of privacy. They sat on a wooden bench, and for a few moments, Megan watched Lucas play with a fallen leaf on the ground. He seemed so innocent, so unaware of what was coming that Megan almost lost her courage. But then she remembered the dreams with Paul, the silent smiles, and the gestures that seemed to encourage her to move forward. She knew she needed to do this for Lucas and for herself. Lucas, Megan began with a soft but firm voice. There's something very important I need to tell you, something about your past. Lucas looked up, curious but without signs of worry. He trusted Megan, felt safe with her, and this made her feel even more determined. You know I care a lot about you, right? She continued, lightly touching his hand. I know, Megan, Lucas replied with a shy smile. I like you a lot too. Megan felt a lump form in her throat but managed to continue. Lucas, I want to tell you about your father. Do you remember asking about him before? Lucas nodded, his eyes now intensely focused on Megan's. She took a deep breath and proceeded. Your father. He was a very special person, and I loved him a lot too. But he's no longer with us. He passed away before you had the chance to meet him. Lucas's expression gradually changed from interest to confusion and finally to sadness. He said nothing, just watched Megan, waiting for her to explain more. Your father's name was Paul, Megan revealed, her voice breaking. And he was my fiancé. We were together when he died. I only recently discovered that you are his son, and that's why I started getting closer to you. I wanted to get to know you better because you are a part of him that is still here. Lucas remained silent, absorbing the words slowly. Megan could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the confusion mixed with the pain of knowing he had a father he never knew, and that this father was already gone. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, he finally asked, So, you were going to marry him? Megan nodded, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Yes, Lucas, I loved your father very much. He was an incredible person, and I know he would have loved you very much too if he had had the chance. Lucas looked down, his small fingers nervously playing with the leaf. Why didn't he ever meet me? Megan took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I don't know all the details, Lucas, but I believe your father didn't know you existed. Sometimes life is complicated, and things happen in ways we don't understand. But I know that if he had known, he would have done everything to be with you. There was a long silence between the two. Megan didn't press Lucas to respond, giving him the time he needed to process everything. Finally, he looked up at Megan, tears streaming down his cheeks. And now, he asked, his voice trembling. "What happens now?" Megan felt her heart tighten, but also a wave of affection and protection flood her being. She approached Lucas, gently hugging him, allowing him to cry on her shoulder. "Now, Lucas, we can move forward together," she said, her voice calm and full of love. "I'm here for you, and if you want, I want to be by your side as your family." Lucas nestled into Megan's embrace, letting the tears flow freely. Gradually, the confusion and pain gave way to silent acceptance. He didn't understand everything that had happened, but he knew that Megan was there and that she loved him. That was enough for him, at least for now. Over time, Lucas began to accept his new reality. He still had many questions, but he knew that Megan was there to help him find the answers. The bond between them strengthened, not just as a memory of Paul, but as something new and genuine based on the affection and trust they were building together. The adoption of Lucas was finalized on a clear and sunny morning, marking the beginning of a new chapter in Megan's and his life. The judge pronounced the words that made legal what was already forming in their hearts. Lucas was now officially Megan's son. As they left the courthouse, Lucas's shy smile reflected both joy and a certain insecurity, while Megan squeezed his hand, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. But as Megan would soon discover, life together would not be without challenges. Despite all the affection they were beginning to share, adjusting to the new reality brought up issues and insecurities that neither of them was fully prepared to face. Lucas, though happy to finally have a mother, still felt the absence of a father figure. At 8 years old, he was at an age where the presence of a father seemed crucial. The questions about what his life would be like if Paul were present, or how he would have related to his father, became frequent. Megan did her best to fill that void, offering love, support, and patience. But she knew there was a limit to what she could do alone. Megan, in turn, faced her own internal battles. The grief for Paul was still a constant presence in her life, a silent ghost that accompanied her in unexpected moments. Every time she saw Lucas's smile, the way he furrowed his brow when he was concentrating, or the sparkle in his eyes when he talked about something that excited him, Megan was reminded of Paul. And although this brought comfort, it also rekindled the pain of loss. Balancing these emotions with the role of a mother was challenging. Megan found herself trying to balance grief with the need to be present for Lucas, to be the mother he needed, but also to honor Paul's memory. Sometimes the weight of these responsibilities overwhelmed her, and she wondered if she was doing enough, if she was being fair to Lucas, to Paul, and to herself. But despite the difficulties, there were moments of pure joy, moments when the new life they were building together seemed full of promises. Megan and Lucas began to create their own traditions, movie nights, park outings, and dinners that, though simple, always ended with shared laughter. These small routines helped cement the bond between them, creating new memories that, though different from what Megan had imagined with Paul, were equally precious. Still, the ghosts of the past didn't completely dissipate. Megan knew that there were many unanswered questions about Paul's relationship with Lucas's mother, about how he could have had a son and never mentioned it. And from time to time, these doubts returned, bringing uncertainties about the future she and Lucas were building. But over time, Megan began to accept that the past, though important, shouldn't completely define her present. Paul would always have a special place in her life and Lucas's, but what mattered now was what they did with the time they had together. Lucas, for his part, also began to understand that although his biological father wasn't there, he could still have a loving family, and that Megan's presence in his life was something to be celebrated. And so, gradually, Megan and Lucas began to find balance, Together they faced the challenges that arose, learning from each other, making mistakes and getting things right, but always with the certainty that despite the shadows of the past, they were building something new and beautiful. The difficulties still appeared, of course, but now, instead of seeming insurmountable obstacles, they were seen as part of the journey they had chosen to travel together. And step by step, day by day, Megan and Lucas began to realize that the new beginning they were creating was stronger than any ghost from the past. The morning was fresh, the air carrying the soft scent of flowers that were beginning to bloom with the arrival of spring. Megan and Lucas walked side by side through the cemetery in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. In Megan's hands, a bouquet of white lilies, Paul's favorite flowers, while Lucas carried a small arrangement of simple but meaningful daisies. When they arrived at Paul's grave, Megan stopped, taking a deep breath. The visits to the cemetery had become part of their lives, a way to keep Paul present, not as a shadow of the past, but as a loving memory that connected them. Megan slowly knelt, placing the lilies on the tombstone, her fingers brushing over the name engraved on the cold stone. Lucas, more reserved, stood beside her for a moment before stepping forward and placing the arrangement of daisies next to the lilies. He was still young, but was beginning to understand the importance of these rituals, not just as a tribute to the father he never knew, but also as a way to solidify his new identity, his new life with Megan. "Would Dad be happy to meet me?" Lucas asked, his soft voice breaking the silence. Megan smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "I'm sure he would, my love. And he would be very proud of you, just as I am." They stayed there for a few more minutes in comfortable silence, each in their thoughts. Megan felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The pain was still there, like a scar that would always be there, but it was no longer an unbearable burden. Instead, it had transformed into something softer, a memory that, though sad, also brought comfort. After a while, they got up and walked to another grave, where Megan placed a small bouquet of white roses in honor of Lucas's biological mother. This ritual, which they performed annually, had become a way to accept Lucas's past, honor the woman who brought him into the world, and recognize the path that had led them to that moment. "She would also be proud of you, Lucas," said Megan, holding his hand, "and I'm grateful to her for bringing you to me." Lucas said nothing, but squeezed Megan's hand, a gesture that spoke more than words. They stayed there for a few more minutes, letting the gentle wind carry away any remaining sadness as the tranquility of the cemetery enveloped them. As they left the cemetery, the sun was already beginning to hide behind the trees, casting long shadows along the path. Megan and Lucas walked together, side by side, the silence between them now filled with understanding and acceptance. When they arrived at a small lookout with a view of the city below, Megan stopped, observing the horizon that stretched out before them. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and unknown moments, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. "We're ready for whatever comes, aren't we, Lucas?" asked Megan, looking at him. Lucas looked at the horizon, then at Megan, and smiled. "Yes, we are." They stood there together, watching the sun set as the city's lights began to shine in the distance. That simple and peaceful moment symbolized everything they had achieved together. Megan realized that despite all the suffering and losses, she had found a new reason to live in Lucas. They had created a new beginning, a future where they could honor the past, but also embrace the possibilities that were yet to come. And so, hand in hand, Megan and Lucas turned toward the path ahead, ready to move forward together, facing whatever the future might bring. There was no more fear, only the certainty that together they could overcome anything. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.